The scissors felt cold against Josephine Barrett's neck as she watched honey-colored locks fall to the wooden floor of her late mother's bedroom in San Francisco, California. Each strand a small surrender to necessity in this autumn of 1878. Her fingers trembled as she cut away the last remnants of the woman she had been just hours before, transforming herself into someone who might survive in a world that had no place for destitute, 22-year-old women with no family and mounting debts that threatened to swallow what little remained of her dignity. The mirror reflected a stranger back at her, a lean-faced young man with haunted eyes and choppy hair that would pass for a ranch hand's careless grooming, and she forced herself to accept this new reality because the alternative was unthinkable, the streets or worse, and Josephine Barrett had promised her dying mother she would survive no matter what it took. She bound her chest with strips of linen torn from old sheets, pulling tight until breathing became an exercise in control, then stepped into her father's old trousers that she had found in a trunk, clothes he had worn before consumption claimed him 3 years past. The fabric smelled of cedar and dust and memories of better times, when her family had owned a small mercantile shop before creditors and cruel fortune stripped everything away. Her mother's passing 2 weeks ago had been the final catastrophe, leaving Josephine alone with nothing but this small rented room she could no longer afford, and a collection of debts that seemed to multiply like rabbits in springtime. The shirt hung loose on her frame despite her curves, and she tucked it carefully into the trousers, adjusting everything until the silhouette looked masculine enough to fool a casual observer. She had practiced lowering her voice for days, speaking in the deeper registers until her throat ached, and now she tested it again in the quiet room. "Name's Joe Barrett, looking for work." The words came out rough and credible, and she nodded at her reflection with grim satisfaction. San Francisco in 1878 was a city of contradictions, where wealth and poverty existed in uncomfortable proximity, where gold rush dreams still flickered in some hearts, while others had long since accepted the harsh realities of survival. Josephine had heard that the cattle ranches outside the city were hiring for the autumn roundup and winter preparations, hard work that paid decent wages for men willing to endure long hours and difficult conditions. For women, there were precious few options that did not involve surrendering independence or dignity, and Josephine had decided she would rather risk discovery than accept such fates. She packed what few possessions she could carry in a worn canvas bag, sold everything else to her landlady for enough coins to settle her final week's rent, and walked out into the morning fog with her heart hammering against her bound chest. The streets were already busy with merchants and laborers, and she kept her head down, her stride long and purposeful like she had observed men walking. None of the careful steps and contained movements that had been drilled into her since childhood. The hiring office for the Palmetto Ranch was located in a weathered building near the waterfront, and Josephine joined a line of rough-looking men who smelled of whiskey and tobacco and hard living. She focused on breathing slowly, on keeping her shoulders square and her expression neutral, on becoming invisible in the way that working men seemed to be invisible to those who employed them. When her turn came, she stepped up to the desk where a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth looked her up and down with skeptical eyes. "Name?" "Joe Barrett," she said in her practiced voice, meeting his gaze directly the way her father had always told her honest men should. "Ever worked cattle before?" "Some," she lied because the truth would get her nowhere. "Helped on a ranch east of here a few years back. Know my way around horses and hard work." The man grunted, writing something in a ledger. "Palmetto Ranch needs hands for the season. $1 a day plus meals and a bunk. Work starts before dawn and ends when the foreman says it ends. You'll take orders and keep your nose clean. Any trouble and you're out without pay. Understood? Understood, Josephine said, hardly believing it could be this simple. Report to the ranch tomorrow at first light. It's about an hour's ride south. Ask anyone for directions to the Palmetto place. They'll point you right. He handed her a piece of paper with the details scrawled in rough handwriting. Don't be late. She left the office with her hands shaking and her mind racing, wondering how long she could possibly maintain this deception. But there was no turning back now. She spent her last few coins on supplies, a bedroll and some basic necessities, and found a quiet spot near the docks to spend her final night in the city that had been her home for all 22 years of her life. Sleep came in fitful bursts, and she rose before dawn to begin the walk south along the rough road that led away from San Francisco's bustling center toward the ranching country beyond. Other men traveled the same route, some on horseback, others on foot like her, and she kept to herself, speaking to no one, observing everything. The Palmetto Ranch sprawled across rolling hills dotted with oak trees, a substantial operation with multiple buildings and extensive corrals where horses moved restlessly in the early morning light. Josephine joined a group of new hires gathering near the main barn, maybe a dozen men of various ages and appearances, all wearing the rough clothing of laborers seeking work. A tall man emerged from the barn, and Josephine's breath caught despite herself because he moved with a natural grace that seemed at odds with his powerful build, broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, long legs encased in worn denim and scuffed boots that had seen countless miles. He was maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. And when he looked over the assembled workers, his gaze was intelligent and assessing in a way that made Josephine's heart skip nervously. "I'm Knox Palmetto," he said, his voice carrying easily across the group. "This is my family's ranch and I run the daily operations. You've all been hired for seasonal work and I expect every man here to earn his wages. We start at dawn, work until the jobs are done. You'll follow orders from me or any of the senior hands. We don't tolerate laziness, drinking on the job, fighting, or stealing. Any questions?" Silence greeted his words, and he nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Let me be clear about something else. This work is hard and sometimes dangerous. If you can't handle it, there's no shame in saying so now and walking away. But if you stay, I expect your best effort every single day. Understood?" A chorus of agreement rose from the gathered men, and Josephine added her deeper voice to the mix, her eyes fixed on Knox Palmetto's face, memorizing the strong features and the way authority seemed to sit naturally on him without arrogance or cruelty. "All right then," Knox said. "My foreman Dan will get you settled in the bunkhouse and assign your duties. Welcome to Palmetto Ranch." The foreman turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He led them to a long, low building that served as the bunkhouse, a sparse space with rows of narrow beds and a few battered trunks for personal belongings. Josephine claimed a bunk in the corner, as far from the others as possible, and stowed her bag quickly while the other men settled in with easy camaraderie born of shared circumstances. "All right, listen up," Dan called out. "We're going to start by checking the boundary fences in the north pasture. That means riding out with tools and supplies to repair any damage before winter sets in proper. Barrett, you'll be with Mitchell and Carson on the east section." Josephine's stomach dropped because she had minimal experience with horses, and none whatsoever with fence repair, but she nodded along with the others, and followed them to the stables where patient ranch horses waited. She watched carefully as the other men saddled their mounts, mimicking their movements with hands that felt clumsy and uncertain. The horse assigned to her was a sturdy bay gelding with kind eyes, and she spoke softly to him as she worked, praying she was doing everything correctly. The saddle felt enormous and complicated, but she managed to get it secured, though probably not as tightly as it should be, and hauled herself up into the seat with less grace than she would have liked. Mitchell and Carson were both older men, weathered and quiet, and they set off without much conversation, which suited Josephine perfectly. She focused on staying in the saddle and following their lead, her body already aching from the unfamiliar position and the horse's movements beneath her. The work itself proved to be grueling physical labor, digging new post holes and stringing wire under the bright autumn sun. Josephine attacked each task with determination, ignoring the blisters forming on her palms and the screaming protests of muscles unused to such demands. Mitchell and Carson worked with efficient economy, and she tried to match their pace despite her inexperience. "You all right there, Barrett?" Carson asked around midday, his weathered face creased with what might have been concern. "You're looking a bit peaked." "I'm fine," Josephine said gruffly, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Just need some water." She had been careful about drinking, aware that needing to relieve herself would present complications she preferred to avoid, but thirst finally drove her to take long pulls from her canteen. The water helped, though the relentless sun continued beating down on them as they worked their way along the fence line. By the time they returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, Josephine felt like every bone in her body had been individually bruised. She cared for her horse the way she had seen the others do, her movements slow and careful, then stumbled toward the bunkhouse with her muscles trembling from exhaustion. Dinner was served in a large communal dining hall, hearty stew and fresh bread that Josephine devoured despite her fatigue. She kept her head down and her conversations minimal, responding to direct questions with brief answers and otherwise remaining silent. The other ranch hands seemed content to ignore the new workers, focused on their own meals and conversations. She was almost finished eating when Knox Palmetto entered the dining hall, moving between the tables with easy confidence, speaking with various workers and checking on the new hires. When he reached Josephine's section, he paused, those whiskey-colored eyes studying her with an attention that made her pulse quicken nervously. "Barrett, is it?" he asked, his voice pleasant but penetrating. "Yes, sir," Josephine replied, keeping her voice low and steady. "How was your first day?" "Good, sir. Hard work, but nothing I can't handle." Something flickered in Knox's expression, too quick to identify, and he nodded slowly. "Glad to hear it. Let Dan know if you have any problems with equipment or supplies." "Will do, sir," Josephine said, and Knox moved on to the next table, but she could feel the weight of his attention lingering even after he had walked away. That night in the bunkhouse, Josephine waited until the other men were asleep, or at least settled, before she carefully changed into a loose shirt to sleep in, keeping her chest bindings in place despite the discomfort. Sleep came hard on the narrow bunk, her body aching and her mind spinning with anxiety about maintaining her deception. But eventually exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into restless dreams. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of endless work, each sunrise bringing new challenges and physical demands. Josephine learned quickly, driven by necessity and determination, and her body began adapting to the constant labor. She learned to rope and brand, to mend saddles and shoes horses, to read the weather and the land and the behavior of cattle. Her hands grew calloused and strong, and she developed the lean, hardened physique of someone who worked from dawn until dusk without rest. But she also became aware of Knox Palmetto's attention, The way his gaze would find her during the workday, watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret. It was not hostile or suspicious, but there was a thoughtfulness to it that made her nervous, like he was working through a puzzle that did not quite fit together properly. 3 weeks into her employment, Knox approached her while she was working alone in one of the smaller corrals, training a young horse to accept a saddle. Josephine looked up as his shadow fell across her, her heart immediately jumping into her throat. "You're good with horses," Knox observed, leaning against the fence rail with deceptive casualness. "Natural feel for them." "Thank you, sir," Josephine said carefully, returning her attention to the horse while acutely aware of Knox's presence just a few feet away. "Where did you say you worked before coming here?" "Ranch east of the city," Josephine replied, repeating her original lie while her mind raced with worry. "Which one?" The direct question caught her off guard, and she hesitated just a fraction too long. "Small operation. Don't recall if it had a formal name. Owner was a man named Smith." Knox was quiet for a long moment, and Josephine could feel his eyes on her, studying, evaluating. "That's a common name," he finally said, his tone neutral. "Yes, sir, it is." Another silence stretched between them, and Josephine focused on the horse, running her hands along its neck in soothing strokes. Her pulse hammered in her ears, certain that Knox was about to call her out, to expose her deception in front of everyone. "Joe," Knox said quietly, and something in his voice made her look up despite her better judgment. His expression was serious but not angry, and when he spoke again, his words were careful and deliberate. "I want you to know that anyone working on my ranch is safe here. If someone is running from trouble or hiding from something or just trying to make a fresh start, that's their business. As long as they work hard and deal straight with me, I don't pry into their past. Understood?" Josephine stared at him, trying to parse the meaning behind his words, wondering if he knew or suspected or was simply stating general policy. "Understood, sir," she managed. Knox nodded slowly, then pushed away from the fence. "Keep up the good work with the horses. You've got a real talent for it." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the corral with her thoughts in chaos. Did he know? The way he had phrased everything suggested he might suspect something, but he had not confronted her directly or demanded answers. Instead, he had offered what sounded like reassurance, a promise of safety and discretion. Josephine finished with the young horse in a daze, her mind returning again and again to Knox's words and the strange, unreadable expression in his eyes. That night she lay awake in her bunk, listening to the snores and breathing of the other ranch hands, wondering what Knox Palmetto truly knew and what he intended to do about it. The next morning, Dan assigned her to work directly with Knox on moving a herd of cattle to winter pasture, and Josephine's anxiety spiked despite her efforts to remain calm. She saddled her horse and joined Knox near the main gate, where he was checking supplies and preparing for the day's work. "Morning, Joe," Knox said easily, handing her a canteen. "It's going to be a long day. We've got about 300 head to move, and some of them are going to be stubborn about it." "I'm ready, sir," Josephine replied, taking the canteen and securing it to her saddle. They rode out together as the sun climbed above the hills, and despite her nervousness, Josephine found herself falling into the rhythm of the work. Knox was an excellent cattleman, reading the herd's movements with practiced ease and positioning himself to guide rather than force them toward their destination. Josephine followed his lead, learning by observation and occasional brief instructions. Around midday, they paused to rest the cattle and water the horses at a small stream. Knox dismounted and stretched, then looked over at Josephine with an expression that was almost friendly. "You're a fast learner," he said. Most new hands take months to develop the instincts you're showing. I pay attention, Josephine said, keeping her voice neutral despite the warmth that bloomed in her chest at his praise. Knox smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious features into something almost boyish. That's a valuable quality. Too many people go through life half asleep, never really seeing what's right in front of them. He pulled some dried meat and bread from his saddlebag and offered half to Josephine, who accepted it gratefully. They ate in companionable silence, sitting on rocks near the stream while the horses grazed and the cattle milled peacefully nearby. "Can I ask you something personal, Joe?" Knox said suddenly, his voice quiet and careful. Josephine's heart stuttered, but she forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." "Are you in danger? Is someone looking for you?" The question was so direct and unexpected that Josephine could not immediately formulate a response. She stared at Knox, at the genuine concern in his whiskey-colored eyes, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "No," she finally said. "No one's looking for me. I just needed work, and there aren't many options for someone in my situation." Knox studied her for a long moment, and Josephine had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through every carefully constructed layer of her deception. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, like I said yesterday, you're safe here as long as you want to be. Whatever your situation is, it's your business." "Thank you, sir," Josephine whispered, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. They finished the meal and resumed moving the cattle, but something had shifted between them, some unspoken understanding that made the air feel charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Knox continued to treat her exactly as he treated the other ranch hands, professional and fair. But there were moments when their eyes would meet across the herd, and Josephine would feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing against her chest like a physical force. As autumn deepened into early winter, Josephine settled more fully into her life at the ranch. She had proven herself capable and reliable, and the other hands had accepted her as one of their own, no longer treating her as a green newcomer. She had her own routines, rising before dawn to help with feeding the horses, spending long days working on whatever tasks Dan assigned, falling into her bunk each night with the bone-deep satisfaction of exhaustion earned through honest labor. But her awareness of Knox Palmetto only grew stronger with each passing day. She noticed everything about him, the way he moved through the ranch with quiet authority, the patience he showed with both animals and men, the occasional flash of humor in his eyes when something amused him. She noticed how he was always the first to step in when heavy lifting was needed, never asking his workers to do anything he would not do himself. She noticed the respect he commanded not through intimidation, but through competence and fairness. And she noticed the way he looked at her, those brief moments when his attention would linger just a fraction too long, his expression thoughtful and almost sad, like he was carrying some burden he could not share. It was nearly December when everything changed. Josephine was working in the barn alone late one evening, finishing up some repairs to tack that had been damaged during the day's work. Most of the other hands had gone to the bunkhouse or into town for their weekly recreation, and she appreciated the quiet solitude. She did not hear Knox approach until he spoke from the barn entrance, his voice soft in the dimness. "You work too hard, Joe. Even the horses get rest sometimes." Josephine looked up, her hands stilling on the leather she had been mending. Knox stood in the doorway with the last rays of sunset backlighting him, turning his figure into a dark silhouette against the fading light. "Just wanted to finish this," she said. "Martinez needs this bridle for tomorrow." Knox walked into the barn, moving with that characteristic grace that Josephine had come to recognize as uniquely his. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see his expression clearly in the lamplight, and what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. "I know," Knox said quietly, his eyes locked on hers. "I've known for weeks now, Josephine." The sound of her real name on his lips was like a physical blow, and she dropped the bridle she had been holding, her hands suddenly nerveless. "I don't know what you mean," she tried, but her voice came out wrong, too high and feminine, stripped of the masculine affectation she had maintained so carefully. "Yes, you do," Knox said gently. "And I need you to understand that your secret is safe with me. I haven't told anyone and I won't. But I also can't keep pretending I don't see you for who you really are." Josephine stood frozen, her mind racing through options and finding none that made sense. Run, fight, deny. She did none of those things, instead simply standing there while tears began to well in her eyes despite her best efforts. "How long have you known?" "I suspected from the first day," Knox admitted. "The way you moved, the way you spoke, little things that did not quite fit. But I was certain by the end of the first week. You're careful, Josephine, but I pay attention to details." "Are you going to fire me?" she asked, her voice breaking on the question. "No," Knox said firmly. "God, no, you're one of the best workers I have. You've earned your place here a dozen times over." He took a step closer, his expression intense and earnest. "But I need to know why. Why the disguise? Why the deception? Are you running from someone? From the law?" "No," Josephine said quickly. "Nothing like that. I just needed work, and no one hires women for decent wages. My mother died and left me with nothing but debts. I was facing homelessness or worse. This was the only option I could think of." Knox's expression softened with understanding and something that looked like admiration. "That took incredible courage," he said quietly, "and resourcefulness. Most people in your situation would have given up or accepted whatever fate was offered." "I promised my mother I would survive," Josephine whispered, "no matter what it took." They stood looking at each other in the lamplight, and Josephine became acutely aware of how close Knox was standing, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his whiskey-colored eyes and the slight stubble on his jaw. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear anymore, from something else entirely, something that had been building inside her for weeks without her fully acknowledging it. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you," Knox said. "You can keep working here as Joe Barrett for as long as you want. Your secret stays between us. Or if you prefer, I can help you find other options, though I'll be sorry to lose you either way." "I want to stay," Josephine said immediately. "I like the work, I like the ranch. I like being able to support myself and not depend on anyone else's charity or demands." Knox smiled at that, a warm expression that made her stomach flutter. "Then you stay. Nothing changes except that you and I both know the truth now. Is that acceptable?" "Yes," Josephine breathed. "Thank you, Knox. You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely, seeing the way his eyes had darkened with an emotion she did not dare name. The moment stretched between them, charged with electricity and possibility, and Josephine found herself swaying slightly toward him without conscious decision. Knox noticed, his breath catching audibly, and for a heartbeat she thought he might close the distance between them. But instead he stepped back, his expression conflicted. "I should let you finish your work," he said, his voice slightly rough, "and get some rest yourself. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." "Yes, sir," Josephine said automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, yes, Knox." He smiled at that, a quick flash of warmth. "Just Knox when we're alone. You've earned that much." He turned to leave, then paused at the barn entrance. "And Josephine, I'm glad you're here, truly." He disappeared into the darkness before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the lamplight with her heart racing and her mind spinning. Knox knew. Knox had known for weeks and had kept her secret, had protected her without her even realizing it. The implications of that were staggering, and beneath the relief and gratitude was something else, something warm and terrifying that she had been trying not to feel. She finished the bridal repairs in a daze, then made her way to the bunkhouse where she changed into her sleeping clothes and climbed into her bunk. Sleep was impossible, her mind replaying every word of the conversation with Knox, every nuance of his expression, the way he had looked at her like she was something precious and rare. The next few weeks passed in a strange new dynamic where Josephine continued to live as Jo Barrett among the other ranch hands, but when she and Knox were alone, the pretense fell away. He would use her real name, speak to her with an openness that he showed no one else, and she found herself seeking out those private moments with increasing frequency. They would ride out together to check fence lines or move cattle, and during breaks, they would talk about everything and nothing. Knox told her about growing up on the ranch, about losing his parents to fever 5 years ago and taking over the operation at just 22, about the challenges of running a business in uncertain economic times. Josephine told him about her childhood in San Francisco, about her father's unsuccessful mercantile shop and her mother's long illness, about the books she had loved to read, and the dreams she had once harbored of becoming a teacher. "You still could," Knox said one afternoon as they sat on a hillside watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Become a teacher, I mean. There are schools that would hire you, especially out here where educated people are scarce." "Maybe," Josephine said, though the idea felt distant and unreal. "But I like what I'm doing now. I like working with the horses and being outdoors. I like feeling strong and capable." She paused, then added softly, "I like being here." Knox turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "I like you being here too," he said quietly, "more than I probably should." "What do you mean?" Josephine asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "I mean that I think about you constantly," Knox admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I mean that every time I see you I have to fight the urge to touch you, to pull you close and never let go. I mean that I'm falling in love with you, Josephine, and I don't know what to do about it because this situation is impossible in about a dozen different ways." Josephine stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Knox," she whispered. "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's wrong of me to say anything. You work for me, you're dependent on this job, and I've put you in an impossible position by confessing my feelings. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything." "No," Josephine said, reaching out to catch his hand before he could pull away. "No, you don't understand. I feel the same way. I've been falling in love with you since the first day I saw you, and it's been torture pretending otherwise." Knox's eyes widened with shock and hope, his fingers tightening around hers. "You do." Instead of answering with words, Josephine leaned forward and kissed him, a brief soft press of her lips against his that sent electricity racing through her entire body. Knox made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist as he deepened the kiss with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Knox rested his forehead against hers. "We can't do this," he said, though his arms remained locked round her. "It's too dangerous. If anyone finds out you're a woman, they'll force you to leave, and if they find out about us, the scandal will destroy both our reputations." "I don't care," Josephine said fiercely. "I don't care about scandal or reputation. I only care about this about us." "You should care," Knox said gently. "Your safety, your future, those things matter. I won't let my feelings put you at risk." "Then what do we do?" Josephine asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Knox was quiet for a long moment, his hands moving in soothing circles on her back. "We're careful," he finally said. "We keep your secret and we find moments like this when we can be ourselves. And when the time is right, when we can figure out how to make it work without destroying everything, we find a way to be together openly. Can you accept that?" "Yes," Josephine said, though the idea of hiding their feelings seemed almost unbearable now that she had tasted the alternative. "As long as I know you love me, I can accept anything." "I do love you," Knox said firmly. "That's the one thing in all of this that I'm absolutely certain of." They sat together on the hillside until the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms and speaking in quiet voices about their hopes and dreams, and the impossible situation they found themselves in. Eventually, they had to return to the ranch, to resume their public roles as employer and employee, but something fundamental had shifted between them, and Josephine felt like she was walking on air despite the complications that lay ahead. Winter settled over the ranch in earnest, bringing cold rains and occasional frost. The work shifted to focus more on maintenance and indoor tasks, repairing equipment and caring for the livestock through the harsher weather. Josephine continued to live in the bunkhouse and work alongside the other hands, but she and Knox found stolen moments together whenever possible, brief encounters in the barn or on remote sections of the property where they could drop the pretense and simply be together. Those moments sustained Josephine through the challenges of maintaining her deception. It was not easy living as a man, binding her chest each morning until breathing was difficult, constantly monitoring her voice and movements, avoiding the communal bathing area, and finding creative ways to maintain her privacy. But the life she had built felt worth the sacrifice, and Knox's love made everything bearable. One evening in late January, Knox asked her to meet him in his office in the main house after the other workers had gone to the bunkhouse. Josephine slipped through the darkness, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness, and found Knox waiting for her with a fire crackling in the fireplace and 2 cups of tea steaming on his desk. "Come in," he said warmly, closing the door behind her and pulling her into a kiss that left them both breathless. "I've been thinking," he said when they finally separated, "about us, about the future, about how to make this work." "And?" Josephine prompted, settling into the chair he offered while he perched on the edge of his desk. "I want to marry you," Knox said bluntly. "I know that's complicated given the current circumstances, but I've been thinking about it constantly, and I believe we can make it work if we're strategic about it." Josephine's heart soared even as her practical mind raised a dozen objections. "How?" "Everyone here knows me as Joe Barrett, a male ranch hand. We can't just suddenly announce that Joe is actually Josephine and we're getting married." "No, we can't," Knox agreed. "But here's what I'm proposing. In the spring, Joe Barrett decides to move on to seek opportunities elsewhere. A few weeks later, I traveled to San Francisco on business and happened to meet a young woman named Josephine Barrett. We court briefly, I propose, and we return to the ranch as husband and wife. The hands will have no reason to connect you with Joe because they'll be looking for a man, not a refined lady." Josephine turned the idea over in her mind, looking for flaws. "Some of them might recognize me," she said slowly, "especially if they pay close attention." "Possibly," Knox acknowledged. "But think about how different you'll look. Your hair will have grown out, you'll be wearing dresses and proper ladies' clothing, you'll be moving and speaking differently. Most people see what they expect to see, and they'll expect to see my new wife, not a former ranch hand." "It might work," Josephine said, hope beginning to bloom in her chest. "But what about in town? In San Francisco, people who knew me before might recognize me and start asking questions. We'll deal with that if it happens, Knox said firmly. We'll say you needed to work for a time after your mother's death, that you did seamstress work or something similar. The truth is, most people don't pay that much attention to working-class women. They're invisible in their own way. Josephine thought about her mother, about how she had become nearly invisible in the last years of her life, as illness and poverty stripped away her social standing. Knox was right. Society had very specific boxes for people, and those who did not fit were often simply not seen at all. "I love you," she said suddenly, fiercely. "And yes, I'll marry you. I want nothing more than to be your wife." Knox pulled her up from the chair and into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her forget every complication and concern. "We'll make it work," he promised against her lips. "Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to be together." They spent the next few hours planning in detail, working through potential problems and solutions, trying to anticipate every possible complication. By the time Josephine crept back to the bunkhouse in the early morning hours, she felt cautiously optimistic that Knox's plan might actually succeed. The winter months passed slowly, each day bringing them closer to spring and the execution of their plan. Josephine continued her work on the ranch, but now everything had the feeling of temporary, of counting down to a moment when her life would transform completely. She and Knox were careful to maintain their public distance, but in private they grew closer, learning each other's habits and preferences, building the foundation of a partnership that would need to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. In early March, Joe Barrett announced his intention to move on, claiming he had heard of opportunities further north that he wanted to pursue. The other ranch hands accepted this without much comment, used to the transient nature of seasonal workers, and Dan simply asked if he would stay through the end of the month to help with spring preparations. Josephine agreed, though every day now felt like an eternity of waiting. Knox had given her money for new clothes and accommodations, and they had planned her transformation in careful detail. She would travel to San Francisco, rent a room in a respectable boarding house, and spend a few weeks relearning how to be a woman in public, letting her hair grow and her body soften from the harsh edges that months of hard labor had created. Her last day at the ranch was harder than she had anticipated. She had grown to love this place, these rhythms of life, even the back-breaking work that had transformed her body and spirit. The other hands shook her hand and wished her well, and Josephine had to fight back tears at their casual kindness. Knox pulled her aside in the barn for a final private moment, his eyes dark with emotion. "This is not goodbye," he said firmly. "This is just a brief separation. In a few weeks I'll come for you and we'll begin our real life together." "I know," Josephine whispered, "but it still hurts to leave." "I love you," Knox said, kissing her softly. "That's not changing no matter how many miles are between us." She left the ranch at dawn with her small bag of possessions, and her heart full of conflicting emotions. The journey back to San Francisco felt both familiar and strange, like returning to a place that no longer quite fit. She rented a room in a modest but respectable boarding house, using the name Josephine Barrett and claiming to be in mourning for her recently deceased mother. The first few days were disorienting. She removed the bindings from her chest and let her body remember how to breathe fully. She bought proper ladies' clothing, simple but well-made dresses and undergarments that felt foreign after months in men's trousers and shirts. She practiced walking in smaller steps, keeping her voice in its natural higher registers, relearning all the feminine mannerisms that she had deliberately suppressed. Her hair was the biggest challenge. Months of rough cutting had left it uneven and short, barely reaching her collar. She visited a proper hairdresser who styled it as best she could, creating soft curls that helped frame her face and disguise the length. It would take time to grow out properly, but the hairdresser assured her that the current style was actually quite fashionable among progressive young women. 3 weeks after leaving the ranch, Knox arrived in San Francisco. He sent a note to her boarding house requesting the pleasure of her company for dinner, formal and proper, as if they were virtual strangers embarking on a courtship. Josephine dressed with trembling hands, choosing her best dress and taking extra care with her appearance. When she descended to the parlor where Knox waited, his expression made every sacrifice worthwhile. He stared at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, his eyes drinking in every detail of her transformation. "Miss Barrett," he said formally, though his voice was rough with emotion, "you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Palmetto," Josephine replied, offering her hand with a smile. He took it and raised it to his lips in a courtly gesture that made her blush, then offered his arm to escort her to dinner. They walked through the streets of San Francisco like any other courting couple, and Josephine felt a wild freedom in simply being herself, being a woman on the arm of the man she loved. Over dinner at a nice restaurant, they maintained the fiction of getting to know each other, asking questions they already knew the answers to, laughing at observations they had shared months ago. But it felt wonderful anyway, this public acknowledgement of their connection, even if the true depth of their relationship remained hidden. Knox courted her properly over the next 2 weeks, calling on her at the boarding house with flowers and small gifts, taking her to dinner and the theater, walking with her through the city's parks and along the waterfront. To any observer, they were simply a prosperous rancher and a respectable young woman falling in love through conventional means. At the end of those 2 weeks, Knox proposed formally in the boarding house parlor, presenting her with a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. Josephine accepted with tears in her eyes, and even though they had planned this moment down to the last detail, it felt completely real and true. They were married quietly a week later by a minister in a small church, with only the boarding house proprietor and her husband serving as witnesses. Josephine wore a simple blue dress and carried a small bouquet of spring flowers, and when Knox slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her to seal their vows, she felt like the luckiest woman in the world. They spent their wedding night in a hotel room in San Francisco, and for the first time, they could be together completely, without deception or hiding or fear of discovery. Knox was gentle and passionate, and Josephine gave herself to him with total trust, their love finally finding full expression after months of restraint. The next morning, they began the journey back to the ranch as husband and wife. Josephine felt nervous as they approached, wondering if anyone would recognize her, but Knox's confidence helped steady her nerves. When they arrived, he introduced her to the assembled workers as his new bride, and she smiled graciously while studying their faces for any sign of recognition. Most of the men simply stared at her, with the awkward discomfort of rough laborers confronted with a lady, offering mumbled congratulations and quickly returning to their work. A few studied her more closely, and Josephine saw confusion flicker across their features as something about her struck them as familiar, but no one seemed to make the connection to Joe Barrett. Dan was the only one who looked at her with dawning understanding in his eyes, his gaze moving from Josephine to Knox and back again. But whatever he suspected, he kept to himself, simply offering his congratulations and a knowing smile before excusing himself to supervise the day's work. Knox showed Josephine to the main house, which would now be their home, and she explored the rooms with genuine delight. It was not a grand mansion, but it was comfortable and well built, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a kitchen that was far better equipped than anywhere she had ever cooked before. "What do you think?" Knox asked, watching her anxiously. "I think it's perfect," Josephine said honestly. "I think this is going to be a wonderful home." Over the following weeks, Josephine settled into her new role as the rancher's wife. It was strange, after months of hard physical labor, to be expected to focus on more domestic tasks, but she found ways to satisfy her need for activity. She took over management of the kitchen garden, started helping with the ranch's bookkeeping, and occasionally, when no one was watching, she would slip into the corrals to work with the horses. Knox caught her one afternoon training a particularly difficult colt, and he leaned against the fence with amusement dancing in his eyes. "You know, most ranchers' wives don't break horses in their good dresses." Josephine looked down at her mud-splattered skirts and laughed. "Most ranchers' wives probably weren't ranch hands first. Old habits are hard to break." "I love that about you," Knox said warmly. "I love that you can't be confined to just one role or expectation." She walked over to him and accepted his kiss, no longer needing to hide or restrain her affection. "I love you too, and I love this life we're building together." As spring turned to summer, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure, and when she told Knox, he picked her up and spun her around with a whoop of delight that brought several ranch hands running to see what the commotion was about. Her pregnancy was relatively easy, and she continued to be active around the ranch despite Knox's worried hovering. By autumn, her belly had grown round and prominent, and the ranch hands treated her with the careful deference afforded to expectant mothers. In December, during a cold snap that frosted the windows and made the fires burn bright, Josephine went into labor. Knox sent for the doctor from town and held her hand through the long, difficult hours, his face pale with worry. When their son finally arrived, squalling and perfect, Knox cried openly with relief and joy. They named him Joseph, after the identity that had brought Josephine to the ranch and ultimately to Knox. The baby had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin, and Josephine felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it almost hurt. Life settled into new rhythms after Joseph's birth. Josephine balanced motherhood with her continued involvement in the ranch's operations, and Knox proved to be a devoted father who would happily abandon work to spend time with his son. The ranch prospered under their combined management, and they became known in the surrounding community as fair employers and good neighbors. When Joseph was 2 years old, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she delivered a daughter they named Catherine, a tiny blonde baby with her mother's fierce spirit evident from the first moment she opened her eyes and stared at the world with determination. The years passed in a happy blur of growth and work and love. Joseph grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses as much as his mother did, while Catherine was adventurous and bold, constantly giving her parents minor heart attacks with her fearless explorations. One evening when Joseph was 8 and Catherine was 6, Josephine and Knox sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm spring air. "You ever regret it?" Knox asked quietly. "Giving up your disguise, your independence, becoming a wife and mother?" Josephine thought about the question seriously, looking back at the desperate young woman who had cut her hair and donned trousers nearly a decade ago. "No," she said honestly. "I don't regret any of it. The disguise gave me the chance to survive and to find you. Being your wife and the mother of your children has given me everything I never knew I wanted. I'm still independent in the ways that matter. I still make my own choices. This life is what I choose." "Good," Knox said, pulling her close and kissing her temple. "Because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "You'll never have to," Josephine promised. As the sun set over the Palmetto Ranch, Josephine reflected on the twists of fate that had brought her here. She thought about her mother, who had made her promise to survive, and hoped that wherever she was, she could see that her daughter had done more than just survive. She had thrived. She had found love and built a family and created a life rich with purpose and joy. The disguise that had once been born of desperation had become the catalyst for everything good in her life. And while she no longer needed to hide who she was, she would never forget the courage it had taken to transform herself, to step outside society's expectations and fight for her own survival. Knox had seen through her disguise almost immediately, but instead of exposing her, he had protected her secret and ultimately given her his heart. That trust and acceptance had been the foundation of everything they had built together. Years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and triumphs. The ranch expanded, requiring more workers and more sophisticated management. Knox brought Joseph into the business as soon as he was old enough, teaching him everything about running a successful cattle operation. Catherine proved to have a gift for breeding horses, developing bloodlines that became sought after throughout California. When Joseph was 16 and Catherine 14, Dan finally retired from his position as foreman. On his last day, he sought out Josephine privately and smiled at her with knowing eyes. "I just wanted to say, madam, that I'm glad Joe Barrett decided to stay all those years ago. Best decision that kid ever made." Josephine understood that he had recognized her from the beginning, or at least from very early on, and had chosen to keep her secret just as Knox had. "Thank you, Dan," she said warmly, "for everything." "You earned your place here 1,000 times over," Dan said firmly. "Both as Joe and as yourself. Don't ever forget that." Joseph took over as foreman with Knox's guidance, and proved to have his father's natural leadership abilities combined with his mother's intuitive understanding of both horses and cattle. Catherine continued developing her breeding program, and at 18, she married a neighboring rancher's son who shared her passion for quality livestock. Knox's hair turned gray at the temples, and Josephine found laugh lines forming around her eyes, but their love remained as strong as ever. They still found moments to slip away together, to ride out into the hills and sit watching the sunset like they had done as young lovers. The physical passion between them had matured into something deeper and more sustaining, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared history. When they became grandparents for the first time, welcoming Catherine's twin boys, Josephine held the babies and marveled at how life had unfolded. From desperate poverty and disguise to this abundance of family and love, the journey seemed almost miraculous. One evening, now in their early 50s, Knox and Josephine sat together in the same office where he had first proposed marriage all those years ago. They were reviewing the ranch's accounts, a task they still did together, when Knox suddenly reached across the desk and took her hand. "I was just thinking," he said softly, "about that first day when you showed up for work. I took one look at you and knew something was different, something special. Even then, before I knew the truth, I was drawn to you in a way that made no sense." "I was terrified you would fire me," Josephine admitted, "but I was also fascinated by you. You were nothing like I expected a ranch owner to be. You were kind and fair, and you actually worked alongside your men instead of just ordering them around." "I think we were meant to find each other," Knox said. "I don't usually believe in fate, but it's hard to think of our meeting as anything else. What were the chances that you would choose my ranch, that I would recognize your disguise but keep your secret, that we would fall in love despite every obstacle. Sometimes I still can't believe it all worked out, Josephine said. There were so many ways it could have gone wrong. But it didn't, Knox said firmly. We made it work because we were brave enough to fight for what we wanted. You were brave enough to disguise yourself and enter a man's world. I was brave enough to trust my heart over convention. Together we built something that has lasted and will continue long after we're gone. Josephine stood and walked around the desk to settle into Knox's lap, wrapping her arms around his neck in a gesture that had become comfortable over decades together. I love you, she said simply. Then, now, and always. And I love you, Knox replied, kissing her softly. My brave girl who cut her hair and wore trousers and changed both our lives forever. They sat together in the quiet office, holding each other as the fire crackled and the ranch settled into evening routines outside. Through the window, they could see Joseph directing the evening feeding, could hear Catherine's laughter as she showed her sons the new foals in the stable. Everything they had built, everything they had created, had started with a desperate act of courage and a cowboy who chose compassion over convention. The disguise was long gone, but the love it had revealed remained constant and true, the foundation of a family and a legacy that would endure for generations. As Josephine rested her head on Knox's shoulder, she sent up a silent thank you to her mother, whose dying wish for her daughter's survival had set everything in motion. She had survived, yes, but she had also thrived beyond anything either of them could have imagined. The Palmetto Ranch prospered through the turn of the century, adapting to changing times while maintaining the values that Knox and Josephine had established. Joseph married a teacher from San Francisco and brought her to the ranch, where she started a small school for the workers' children. Catherine's breeding program became renowned throughout the West, and her twin boys grew up to expand the operation even further. Knox and Josephine aged gracefully together, remaining active in the ranch's management well into their 60s. They became beloved figures in the community, known for their generosity and wisdom, and young couples would sometimes seek their advice on building lasting marriages. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Knox surprised Josephine with a trip back to San Francisco. They stayed at the same hotel where they had spent their wedding night and wandered the streets where he had courted her openly for the first time. The city had changed dramatically, but their memories remained vivid and precious. You remember that boarding house where you stayed? Knox asked as they walked along the waterfront. I was so nervous calling on you, even though I already knew you better than anyone else in the world. You brought me flowers, Josephine recalled with a smile. Daisies, because they reminded you of sunshine, you said. You still love daisies, Knox observed, because they still remind me of that time, of starting over and building something real together. They visited the church where they had been married, now surrounded by taller buildings but still standing strong. The minister who had performed their ceremony had long since passed, but Josephine could still hear his words echoing in her memory, the promises they had made to each other that had proven truer than either of them could have known. When they returned to the ranch, their children and grandchildren had organized a celebration with all the workers and many neighboring families attending. There was music and dancing and an abundance of food, and Josephine found herself dancing with Knox under the stars just as they had done at their small wedding reception 30 years before. Happy anniversary, my love, Knox whispered in her ear as they swayed to the music. Happy anniversary, Josephine replied. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, all those years ago. Thank you for being brave enough to let yourself be seen, Knox countered. As the years continued to pass, they faced the inevitable challenges of aging, Knox developed arthritis that made riding painful, and Josephine's eyesight began to fail, requiring spectacles for reading. But they faced these changes together with the same partnership that had sustained them through everything else. On a warm spring day in 1918, 40 years after Josephine had first arrived at the ranch disguised as Joe Barrett, Knox suffered a heart attack while working in the stable. He died in Josephine's arms, his last words a declaration of love that left her both heartbroken and grateful. The funeral drew people from across the state, testament to the life Knox had lived and the respect he had earned. Josephine stood dry-eyed through the service, her children and grandchildren surrounding her with support, and spoke about her husband with a clarity and love that moved everyone present. After the funeral, after the guests had departed and the ranch had settled back into its routines, Josephine walked out to the hillside where she and Knox had first confessed their love. She sat on the same spot, looking out over the land they had built together, and finally let herself cry. She cried for the loss of her partner, her love, her best friend. She cried for all the moments they would not share, all the grandchildren's milestones he would miss, all the sunsets they would not watch together. But underlying the grief was gratitude, deep and sustaining, for the 40 years they had been given, for the life they had created from such unlikely beginnings. Joseph found her there as the sun was setting, and sat beside his mother in silence for a long moment. "He loved you so much," he finally said. "Everyone could see it." "I know," Josephine said, "and I loved him just as much. That's what made it all worthwhile, the disguise and the fear and the complications. Finding that kind of love was worth every risk." "Tell me again," Joseph asked, as he had many times over the years. "Tell me about how you met." So Josephine told the story once more, about a desperate young woman who cut her hair and wore trousers to survive, and about a cowboy who figured it out and kept her secret. She told about falling in love despite impossible circumstances, about building a life together through courage and trust, about creating a family and a legacy that would endure. When she finished, the stars had come out, bright and clear in the California sky. Joseph helped his mother to her feet, and they walked back to the house together, where Catherine was waiting with tea and comfort. Josephine lived another 12 years after Knox's death, remaining active in the ranch's operations and watching her grandchildren grow into capable adults who carried forward the values she and Knox had established. She saw the ranch survive the challenges of the Great Depression through careful management, and the loyalty of workers who considered it more than just a job. She told her story to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, wanting them to understand that sometimes survival required courage and creativity, that love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, and that the choices made in desperate moments could lead to extraordinary lives. On a quiet evening in 1930, Josephine Barrett Palmetto passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family in the house she had shared with Knox for so many years. She was 74 years old, and had lived a life far richer and fuller than the desperate young woman cutting her hair in 1878 could ever have imagined. At her funeral, held in the same church where she and Knox had married, the minister spoke of her courage and compassion, of the family she had raised and the community she had served. But it was Catherine who told the real story, who shared the truth about Joe Barrett and the cowboy who had seen through the disguise to the remarkable woman beneath. "My mother taught me that we don't have to accept the limitations others place on us," Catherine said, her voice strong despite her tears. "She taught me that love sees the truth even when the world sees only surfaces. She taught me that courage comes in many forms, and that the family we build is the greatest legacy we can leave." She was extraordinary, not because she wore trousers or ran cattle, but because she lived authentically and loved completely. My father recognized that in her from the very beginning, and their love story changed all of our lives for the better. Josephine was buried next to Knox on the hillside where they had first confessed their love, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the years of their lives. But their real monument was the ranch itself, still thriving and growing, still employing workers fairly and treating both animals and people with respect, still embodying the values that a desperate young woman and a compassionate cowboy had established so many years before. The story of Joe Barrett and Knox Palmetto became family legend, passed down through generations. Great-grandchildren who never knew them personally grew up hearing about the woman who disguised herself as a man and the man who kept her secret, about a love that defied convention and created something lasting and true. The Palmetto Ranch continued operating well into the 21st century, evolving with the times but never losing sight of its founding principles. In the main house, now preserved as a museum, visitors could see photographs of Knox and Josephine, could read the journals Josephine had kept, could hear recordings of Catherine telling her mother's story. The most popular exhibit featured the trousers and shirt Josephine had worn during her time as Joe Barrett, carefully preserved and displayed alongside her wedding dress and photographs of her later life. The contrast between the rough work clothes and the refined lady's garments told a story of transformation and courage that resonated with visitors from all walks of life. But perhaps the most telling artifact was a simple leather-bound journal that Knox had kept, his private thoughts recorded in precise handwriting. The entry dated October 15, 1878, just 2 weeks after Josephine had arrived at the ranch, read, "There is something extraordinary about the new hand, Joe Barrett. I cannot quite name it, but I find myself watching for glimpses of him throughout the day. Whatever secret he carries, I hope he trusts me enough to share it eventually. There is a quality about him that calls to something in my soul, and I am drawn to him in ways that both confuse and intrigue me." And later, dated November 27, 1878, "I know her secret now, and it changes everything and nothing. She is remarkable, this woman who had the courage to disguise herself and enter a man's world. I am falling in love with her, have perhaps been falling in love with her from the first moment I saw through her disguise to the determined soul beneath. I will protect her secret and her safety, and somehow, some way, I will find a way to make her my wife. This I promise to myself and to God." These entries, displayed in the museum, never failed to move visitors who read them, evidence of a love that had recognized itself despite every obstacle, that had chosen courage over convention and built something lasting from the most unlikely beginnings. The story of Josephine and Knox Palmetto became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are, of courage in the face of impossible circumstances, of love that transcends society's rigid expectations. It reminded each new generation that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with desperate acts of survival, and that compassion and acceptance can transform everything. On the hillside where Josephine and Knox were buried, wildflowers grew in abundance each spring, daisies prominent among them, bright spots of sunshine that seemed to bloom in celebration of a love story that had started with a disguise and ended with a legacy that would endure forever. The Palmetto Ranch stood as living proof that courage and love, combined with hard work and integrity, could create something that transcended time and circumstance. And sometimes, On quiet evenings when the sun painted the California hills in shades of gold, workers and family members alike would swear they could feel the presence of the ranch's founders, could sense Knox and Josephine watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created, their spirits forever intertwined in the place where a desperate young woman had found not just survival, but a love that transformed her entire world. The end.